Hi everybody, this is Dan Stolbarker and I'd like to welcome you to this week's KFIR Middle East Update. It's the week of July 20th. Now, first things first, make sure you go to our website at Holy Ground Explorations. Click the blog tab and there you'll see a place that you can retrieve both the YouTube site as well as the PDF. It's important that you grab that PDF because on that PowerPoint there's going to be more information that we have time to cover in this 15-minute YouTube. Lots to cover, so let's jump right in today. Again, as I've mentioned, this is the week of July 20th. These headlines come to you from Israel, so think of it from an Israel perspective. And we're going to talk about this deal, obviously, between the P5 and the Iranians, but keep this in mind. The bottom line is that the world is gambling with the future of Israel. That's really what it's all about. It's the future of Israel. Now, again, this is coming from the Israeli news sources. The Iranian deal simply rewards Iran. It gives them close to $150 billion of assets that it now can use to fuel terrorism, their aggressiveness in the region, as well as their efforts, or ongoing efforts, to destroy Israel. In Israel, the date circled July 14, 2015, because it was on this day that the leading exporter of global terrorism received a stamp of legitimacy from the international community. It will be a day that will live in infamy. Now, a couple other things, again, from Israel. The negotiations with Iran has proved once and for all, without a shadow of a doubt, to the everyday Israeli, that the U.S. can no longer be counted on. That's a pretty heavy statement, but it is reality. And finally, even if this deal succeeds, the reality is that the world today is a more dangerous place. Well, some questions that Israel would like to ask these P5+1 nations. Number one, has the Iranian regime been required to halt its arming, its financing, and training of the Hezbollah terrorists, the army in southern Lebanon? And of course the answer is no. This kind of non-nuclear issue was not discussed at these negotiations. Okay. Two, has the Iranian leadership agreed to stop inciting hatred among its people against Israel and the United States, and to stop its relentless calls for the annihilation of Israel? The answer, no. This kind of non-nuclear issue was not discussed at the negotiations. Three, has the Iranian regime agreed to halt executions? Did you know that currently there are 3 executions a day in Iran? And this is the highest rate for 20 years, in the last 20 years. And of course the answer is no, this kind of non-nuclear issue was not discussed at the negotiations. So finally, has Iran agreed to anywhere, anytime inspections, an end to research and development on faster centrifuges, dismantling key nuclear sites, any of that? And the answer, of course, is no, 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 and no. All no's. And this is a deal that Israel's asked to accept. Once again, all those chips that are in are the future of Israel. Now, 4 main problems. I mean, this is volumes, but let's just simplify it. What are the 4 main problems of this deal? And this is from the ambassador, the UN ambassador from Israel, Ron Dermir. He says, number 1, first you have to understand, it leaves Iran with a vast nuclear infrastructure. Number 2, the restrictions that are being placed on Iran's nuclear program are only temporary, with the most important restrictions expiring in 10 years. Third, because states throughout our region, they know that this deal paves Iran's path to the bomb. So what's it going to do? It will start an arms race so everybody can get their hands on their own nuclear bomb. And fourth, we've already mentioned Iran gets $150 billion to increase their subversive activities in the region, to support terror, Hamas, Hezbollah, you name it, Syria, and of course to strengthen the oppressive rule of the current Ayatollah. These are the problems with this deal. Now, let's listen to a different voice. That's the Israeli voice. Let's listen to the voice of the ex-CIA chief. His headlines is that the Iran deal is worse than worthless. The current negotiations with Iran will provide them billions of dollars. They will fund terrorism with that. They'll pursue nuclear weapons. This comes to you by former director of the CIA, James Woosley. He goes on to say, let's not make any mistakes. Tehran has a long history of misleading the world. He said last Friday's government-sponsored Quds Day, these rallies in which the masses again shouted death to America and death to Israel, are a good example of why we shouldn't be overly optimistic. Once again, that's not coming from Israel, that's coming from the states. And here's something to reflect upon, is it's what the world is seeing. You know, Obama's legacy, again, I think this is what he wants it to be, but the reality is that his legacy will be that he accomplished his goal, as crazy as this goal may sound, to weaken America in the eyes of the world. This article is entitled America the Weak. And the picture of Obama, the caption says, if you project weakness long enough, eventually others will believe it. The way in which these negotiations were conducted underscore the weakness of the U.S. The Obama administration was willing to offer almost unlimited concessions to the skillful Iranian negotiators, ignoring all of its own deadlines as well as its red lines. It is clear that Obama was desperate for a deal in order to leave office with a, quote, legacy. While Washington pats itself on the back and congratulates itself on a, quote, successful result, what counts is the perception of the countries in the region. Alas, all countries in the region can only conclude that America is indeed weak, that America capitulated to Iran. Now, we hear a lot about Israel, what they're saying. What about Egypt? What about the Saudis? Well, Israel was the public leader of the opposition of this nuclear deal with Iran. It was quietly joined by both the Saudis as well as the Egyptians, and they have not hidden their displeasure with the deal, and they have hinted that they plan to advance their own nuclear program. Now, as this has come up, the U.S. has called upon the Saudis especially to promise that this program will be used solely for civilian purposes, but the Saudis have refused to do so. The Iran nuclear deal will only prompt Saudi Arabia to accelerate the development, that is, of its own nuclear program, including its military options and dimensions. Now, back to Israel, there was a poll that was done this last week in Israel, and almost half of the Israelis were support a unilateral strike to prevent Iran from obtaining the nuclear bomb. This is an opinion poll that was in the Miraz newspaper. And bottom line, it says, asked, do you support independent military action by Israel against Iran if such action is needed to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon? 47% said yes, 35% said no, and 18% expressed no opinion. The reason I bring this up is because of this next article that's entitled Read the Fine Print. Because we're hearing about the military option being on the table. This from both Yalan, the Israeli Secretary of Defense, as well as Netanyahu. We covered that last week. But the fine print of this particular deal, listen up, it says, one particularly interesting detail tucked away near the end of the deal's massive text is a section entitled Nuclear Safety, Safeguards, and Security, which stipulates that the West, consisting of the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China, as well as the EU, will train Iran to thwart sabotage against its controversial and covert nuclear program from all threats. Are you hearing this? This is the fine print. As I read this, when I hear Israel saying the nuclear, if they get close, we'll use military options to take it out. This fine print says, and you know who's going to oppose that of taking place? Can you imagine American rockets taking down Israeli jets? It's the world in which we're living. It's part of the deal. So, is it a surprise of the outrage in Israel that's taking place at this time? Well, before we leave, just a little bit of good news. Oh, Canada, let me clap. Let me applaud you. Despite enthusiasm by many with the nuclear deal with Iran, Canada remains skeptical and will base its decision on Iran's actions, not their words. The world is rushing to establish diplomatic and economical ties with Iran following the signing of this agreement, this accord. However, Canada has stated it will keep its sanctions in place, at least for now, despite the agreement. Nevertheless, at the same time, we will continue to judge Iran by its actions, not its words. Well done, Canada. Now, out of Germany, the German vice chancellor is in Iran right now. Now, I don't know if this is as loud as Canada was, but the German vice chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel, urged Iran at the start of a 3-day visit to improve its relationship with Israel if it wants to establish closer economic ties with Germany and other Western powers. His quote, questioning Israel's right to exist is something we Germans cannot accept. He said, adding that now that Berlin and Tehran could establish closer relationships and ties, it was these sort of items that need to be discussed, the issues of human rights. Well, right when you might get a little hopeful over that, let me dash your hopes. Because the Ayatollah has spoken out. His words from Khamenei. Iran's Khamenei hails his people for demanding death to America and death to Israel. In a vicious speech, the leader says he hopes God will answer these prayers. He vows that the nuclear deal won't change Iran's support for Palestine, its opposition to America, and the pursuit of annihilating Israel off the face of the map. So despite what the German chancellor is hoping for, listen to the supreme leader. Their desire to wipe Israel off the face of the map, that God would answer their prayers regarding death to America. Sometimes I'm amazed that we still are sleeping through this. I hope that this is an earthquake that wakes us up to what's really taking place. And then finally, the last article that I have for the YouTube is kind of an FYI. The father of the Tennessee shooter is Palestinian Muhammad Yusuf Abazuzi, who murdered 5 U.S. Marines in Chattanooga this last week. Did you know that this is the 3rd Muslim of Jordanian Palestinian descent to massacre U.S. military or intelligence personnel in the last 6 years? Ironically, the father of this terrorist, despite the fact that he used to be on the FBI terrorist watch list, is employed as an unarmed special policeman by the Chattanooga City Council. Hear me. This was a terrorist event happening on American soil. Our hearts are ripped out. May we pray for the families of those victims. But let's not gloss this over. Let's tell it like it is. Terrorism once again has come to our shores. Now, this is again a perspective. They, the Palestinians, have been terrorizing Jews in Israel for almost 70 years. Now they have moved to the U.S. and Europe. And American people, you have to understand, you've got an enemy. It's an enemy that Israel's had, as we mentioned, for 70 years. The truth is, we must wake up. The problem is that the White House is unwilling to face this truth. So again, I mentioned there's one more article. I hope you get to it, read it. It's an open letter to Obama and Kerry from Rabbi Penny Dumar. It's about accountability and responsibility. It's a must read, okay? But we'll conclude here praying for the peace of Jerusalem, standing with Israel today, and not being silent anymore. KFIR, young lions, let your roar be heard. With that, God bless you and shalom.